So Andrew will talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have the discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Suhail, and thank you for everyone for coming out this evening. It's not very pleasant out there, so it might be a better idea to stick around for a bit. But I would say it's probably not going to be very pleasant in here. Can I just get a show of hands of how many people have been through the UK undergraduate system? Okay, so about half of you, maybe slightly less. But what I'm going to talk tonight is what's happening in England, and I will do my best to give as much information as possible for those of you who've only just come into the UK to study at an MA here, for example, and also those of you who may not be so familiar with what's been happening in England in the last few years. I'm going to talk about student debt and the politics of English higher education, and I'm going to try and do precisely what Suhail outlined, which is I'm going to explain to you what the next steps in English higher education policy are likely to be, and why finance is central to that. And the thing just to say about the UK's self-understanding, particularly people in the Cabinet Office, people in the Treasury, is they think that England has it cracked. It thinks that we have solved the problem of funding higher education. And in fact, many people think that the US will have to fundamentally change the way it finances higher undergraduate study in the next few years and transform into what we're doing here. And also at the same time, there's a strong desire amongst policymakers in the UK to be an export industry, to export our expertise and our policy around the world. So there's a real desire to be the frontline thinkers here. And so what I'm going to sort of try and explain tonight is not just why tuition fees are so high, but why the loans play a fundamental part. And not just because loans are a cheaper way of funding higher education, but loans do something else. Loans go out into the world, and the way in which they are repaid generates information. And that information is crucial for one clear reason. The government funds universities to deliver undergraduate teaching. The government has very little information about what goes on inside the lecture theatre, inside the seminar room. The government fundamentally doesn't know which universities are good and which ones aren't. And there are 140 universities in the United Kingdom. What the government thinks that loans will do is the manner in which loans are repaid will give us information about which courses and which institutions are better than others, because they produce graduates who earn more and therefore repay more of their loans. So what I'm about to sort of set out tonight is really the way in which the UK is going to create a system of accounting for higher education. And in that system of accounting, the graduate will be the bearer of the unit of account. The graduate will go to university, take out a loan, leave university, and then over the next 30 years, a bit more, over the next 3 decades, they will make repayments against that loan. And those repayments will distribute in different patterns, and we'll see very high repayments from people who do economics at Oxford, and much lower repayments from people who do art and design. And so at the end of my talk, I'm going to talk particularly about art and design, because I would say the pressing issue for art and design institutions, certainly from 2020 onwards, is to justify their place in the English higher education system. And so the sort of outline I'm going to show you tonight is that the UK government thinks it's got something cracked. It's solved a number of issues. It thinks it's solved a number of issues in English higher education, but certain subjects placed in that system now look under threat. And that's what I'll attempt to show in the next half hour. I'm very happy to take questions of clarification as we go along. I'm going to show some graphs. Those graphs will be unfamiliar to most people. If something's really not clear, please shout out and I'll explain at this point. It's much easier for me to do questions of clarification as we go along, and that will probably benefit everybody, than for you to hold them back for a question in 45 minutes' time. But make sure they're questions of clarification rather than points of fundamental disagreement. One of the things I'm going to be doing is, in a certain sense, I'm going to be ventriloquizing. I'm going to be explaining to you how the government approaches the problem, and it will probably become more apparent in sort of questions afterwards how I position myself against that. But really, I think the first thing to understand in terms of the politics of UK higher education is first to understand what they're trying to do and how they're going about it. And so I will spend most of the time simply setting that out as far as possible. Okay, so first thing to get grasp for those of you who've not from the UK is that all universities in England are private. They're not state-owned in any form. They're all private institutions. They're all independent legal entities, but they're funded by government, now through loans to institutions, and there are grants to institutions, whether for research, for teaching high-cost subjects, and there are some capital grants left in the systems, certain amounts of money that go to institutions to build new facilities. But the government does not run universities. Universities are not in the public sector. Academics are not civil servants, which is the case in European countries, Italy, for example. So fundamentally, the government's role is to provide money to the universities. And in the 2011 white paper, which was the key document for the coalition government, who set in train the current phase of higher education policy, they pretty much set out a very clear vision of how they saw this relationship working. They described it as a public-private partnership. And that what a degree is understood to be is it's understood to be a human capital investment that benefits the private individual insofar as it enables that individual to boost future earnings. And that effectively treats the qualification as a financial asset. This kind of definition will be key for later points because the government has an ideological belief that if you've genuinely had good training, a good university education, you will be more productive, you will have more skills, and in a free market economy, the reward for those skills is higher earnings. And the corollary of that is people who earn more have more skills, are more productive, got better education. So this is the sort of first fundamental thing to get hold of. Higher earnings are a sign from graduates are a sign that their university course was good. The next phase of this is that then, and this is what I've outlined already at the beginning, is that universities will then be judged by how well they do provide training that increases graduate earnings profiles and in particular boosts national productivity. It's a very clear agenda now from the government about why it's funding English higher education. This is what it wants to see, skills and genuine accumulation of graduate skills, as opposed to skills that you could pick up in a private training company, like an Excel course or a course in how to build databases, or in further education. And this is the kind of key contour for perhaps discussion of the creative arts, is there will be pressures in future to move some subjects out of higher education and into further education, where there's much less money available. So just to explain a bit more about the human capital investment, and I think I gave you a reference for this essay here, Milton Friedman's The Role of Government in Education. I certainly gave it to Suhail. This, if you like, is the text, the key document to understand that everything is trying to be achieved in the UK. Although it's written in 1955, it has everything in there, including the particular kind of loans that we're going to be looking at. But Milton Friedman described human capital investment in this way. Education is a form of investment in human capital precisely analogous to investment in machinery, buildings, or other forms of non-human capital. Its function is to raise the economic productivity of the human being. If it does so, the individual is rewarded in a free enterprise society by receiving a higher return for his services. And the 2016 white paper, which was published last summer by the new Conservative government, explicitly said increasing productivity will be the main driver of economic growth in years to come, and improving skills are an essential component of this. So this is to sort of set up the general position of the UK government. In the course of this, the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to set out a kind of overview, a kind of potted history of what's been happening in England, starting with the rapid expansion of university places in the 1990s, late 80s, 1990s, then looking at income contingent repayment loans, which in many ways are viewed as the silver bullet, the solution that we will sell to America to fund higher education. And understanding why this kind of loan is different from other kind of loans is really the key to understanding why there's so much enthusiasm for student debt amongst university managers and amongst politicians. In particular, we'll look at the fact that this solution spared universities the austerity that was seen in other sectors, like the public sector, things like further education and local government. And the key claim is that income contingent loans in their repayment structure mimic a progressive graduate tax. So graduates who earn less than other graduates will repay less than those. And that, in fact, I'll show some charts to show just how dramatic that claim is meant to be. And then I'll look at this idea that the government is effectively now an investor and wants to see a return on its investment. And particularly the issue is whether loans get repaid or not. And then I'll talk at the end about creative arts. Okay, so here's the first diagram. And this goes back to 1972, goes up to 2010, and it shows the percentage of an age cohort, school leavers initially, who go on to higher education. So the API index is a slightly different measure. That measures 18 and 19-year-olds. And the one at the end, the higher education index of participation rate, is under 30s. So how many people, firstly, under 20, go on study to undergraduate study, and then how many under 30? And you can see that it jogs along at 15% until 1988. So only less than 1 in 6 of people in the 1980s got to go to university in England. In some ways, it was seen as a laughingstock that we sent so few people into higher education. And in many ways, this is one of the examples of what you might see as an intergenerational injustice. Plenty of people who now get to go to university would have been deprived of that chance in the 1980s. And suddenly, under a Conservative government, the final days of Margaret Thatcher and the early days of John Major, there's an enormous explosion. The percentage of people going to university doubles in under a decade. A massive expansion in higher education. And that's not just that polytechnics were converted to universities. The polytechnics are already included in here. There's a huge shift in higher education. And then in more recent years, under Tony Blair's administration, there's a huge jump again. And in fact, in the last few years, those figures have gone even higher, and now 55% of women under 30 do some form of undergraduate study from England. So there's a huge transformation in participation. But at the same time, something happened. This is a chart showing the unit of resource. So that's how much money did the university get per student in the same years. And you can see that what happened with this expansion period from about 1980s is suddenly there was a huge drop in how much money universities were getting per student. It went down almost as low as £5,000 per student. And the universities protested against this, and in the 90s they threatened to introduce their own fees outside of government policy, and eventually there's been a series of compromises, and the tuition fee has stabilised, if you like, the unit of resource. But this was a period of rationing, if you like, rationing of places and then rationing of funds, under which most university administrators had their professional careers. This is the kind of traumatic memories of the early 1980s and the 1990s, is not being very well funded. And then what happened is we've completely changed the system. There are now no caps on university places. A university can recruit as many home students as it's able to take, and the government will provide loans to them. There's now a tuition fee of £9,000, and this effectively is seen as a solution to this problem. No more rationing of places and a kind of stable level of funding of about £9,000 per student, which compares nicely with the high point on this diagram here. So there are basically 4 arguments in favour of the current fee loan regime. The 4 arguments which means that policymakers have an alliance with university managers. The first one is universities were spared austerity from 2009. The second one is no more rationing. So all caps on undergraduate placements have been lifted. There's no longer a central control, with each university being giving an allocation of how many undergraduate students it could take on. And the argument is that it's fairer that the individual who sees a gain in future earnings from studying, it's fairer for them to pay more through loan repayments than it is to give them free education. And similarly, there's kind of secondary argument, because we still haven't got universal provision. It's still only 50% of the under 30s who go, so half of people don't go to university. It's unlike primary and secondary education in that way, which are universally provided. It's unfair to ask those who did not or do not get to go to university to contribute more to make it free. So the argument is that back in the 80s, when I showed you when only 1 in 6 were going to university, and there were no tuition fees and students got grants, that was basically a middle-class perk. That's the argument made. Middle classes got university education as a nice freebie, but a lot of people didn't get to go. But if you open it up and charge people for going, you can enable more people to go to university. And there is still some public subsidy that continues in loan non-repayment. So here's a graph of why universities were spared austerity, the kind of caption at the bottom. The green is undergraduate fee income. The blue at the bottom is direct teaching grant to universities. And this is how much income universities as a whole in England get for teaching. And you can see it's increased during austerity from 2009. It's gone from 13 billion to 15 billion. But what's meant that universities were spared the cuts that we saw in further education and the crisis that we have in local government is grant has been replaced by full-time fee income backed by student loans. The other important thing there is the purple, which is your overseas fee income from non-EU students. You can see how significant that is to keeping universities' finances going. So that's why so many people were in favour of it. Vice-chancellors didn't want to have to sack staff, didn't want to have to close courses, and the switch from direct grant funding to loan funding meant they reached a compromise with government. They maintained their income, and so they haven't had to do the kind of things that we've seen in other bits of public services. This is a more complicated diagram I'll skip over in the interest of time, and I'll move on to an explanation of income contingent repayment loans. If it was just that we were mimicking the American government, there is no way we would have got the consensus from universities, basically, for that transfer from grants to fees. And the key thing is income contingent repayment loans. So, some of you are probably paying these off at the moment, but the key issue is the first point. What you repay per month is determined by income, not by the amount borrowed. And there's an income threshold, which is set against your gross income, and there's a repayment rate as a marginal percentage above that threshold. So in the case of England, 9% of your gross income over £21,000 a year is what you repay in annual repayments. So someone on £30,000 a year income repays £810 a year, 9% of £9,000, regardless of how much debt they have. This is very different from the United States, where the payment terms on most loans mean students have to repay eye-watering amounts very quickly after graduation. The key idea about income contingent repayment loans is that graduates in their early years are protected, and in particular women are protected, and I'll show you some graphs why that's the case. So it's distinct from a fixed period repayment loan where the balance is cleared within a defined period. It's potentially open-ended. It asks for 9% of your income over £21,000. In some schemes, for example in America, you might find these pay-it-forward schemes. It's effectively they're asking you for 9% of a share of your income for your whole life times earnings. But in the UK, we have a policy write-off, which means that 31 years after graduation, regardless of how much is owing on your student loan balance, that balance is written off, cleared, and effectively that's when your repayments stop. That's a key protection for low and middle earners. You could design an income repayment scheme which was much more onerous, and most of the ones proposed in America aren't very good for these kind of reasons. The threshold isn't high enough, and the write-off period is too long, if there's one at all. So that's the key thing to get. There's a built-in protection. Australia and New Zealand were the first places to innovate with these, but the understanding now is that amongst policymakers that England has it cracked. And in 2012, the OECD said England has the most advanced student support system in the developed world, more advanced than any of those other countries we've seen, because of this repayment structure. So, just for some details, if you start at university in 2015-16, you might graduate with £60,000 of debt, £9,000 fee loan per year, and up to £10,700 maintenance loan per year if you study full-time in London, plus interest accumulating on that. So you might come out of university with £60,000 of debt. The repayment threshold is £21,000, It's meant to be reviewed again in 2021. The original idea was it would be indexed in line with average earnings, and that's a really crucial point that perhaps will come up in questions. The government has done itself a real disservice by not sticking with the original policy. The repayment rate, like a tax, is 9% of gross income over that threshold, and there's an interest rate while studying. The interest rate gets a lot of bad coverage in the press and a lot of misleading coverage in the press. I'll show you in some future diagrams, right? It's really key to getting more repayments out of very high earners. And then there's the policy write-off. So when you graduate, if you graduate in 2015, your student loan balance will be cleared in 2046. So we're talking very long-term projections here. And the key point, it's loss-making. The government expects to lose 23p for every pound it lends. And this is very different from the United States, for example, where there's disputes about whether the federal government makes money on its student loan system or not. So government only expects 77p in the pound to come back from what it's lent, but that's an average figure. And the key thing we'll talk about in the time that remains is what's hidden behind that average. Okay, so this is the key point, is that the income contingent loans mimic what looks like a progressive graduate tax. Here's a diagram which is a bit out of date. It's taken from my book. So the new system is what we've had in place since 2012 with £9,000 tuition fees. The current system is the fee, the 3,000 fee system, which was in place until 2011-12. And you can see two things from this graph. Low earners up to the 30th percentile of lifetime earnings distribution. So this is projections of everybody's earnings over the next 30 years. The bottom third, will repay less under the new scheme, despite having that much higher graduating debt than they did on the old scheme. And that's what the work of the repayment threshold does. The £21,000 threshold protects lower earners. And then much higher earners repay much more, which hopefully is clear. This gap here, this is much more repayments being taken from higher earners. And that's a function of the real interest rate. The real interest rate keeps those high earners in repayment for longer, and so gets more money out of them. And so this mimics, in a sense, a proportionate or a progressive income tax. High earners repay much more than lower earners. And for a certain kind of economist, this is much fairer. The bend of that curve, the bending up of this curve here to here, means you're getting much more money from higher earners. That's a much better thing to do. This is the graph why Ed Miliband was unable to get his £6,000 tuition fee policy through the Labour Party in any good shape, because basically by lowering fees from 9,000 to 6,000, you're basically going to save money. You're going to save these people money and do nothing for these people. So on a certain economic reading, the Labour Party's pledge to lower tuition fees to 6,000 was regressive. It was only going to give a tax break to middle-class graduates. A slightly more complicated graph, which I'll probably skip over, shows pretty much the same thing. But what it has here is this one has percentage of lifetime earnings up the side here. And you can see under the old scheme, low earners repaid much higher percentage of their lifetime earnings, and what's happening now is that very high earners were getting more money, much more money from them. It looks fairer to a certain kind of economist for that reason. And note the difference. Someone in the bottom decile of earnings is only likely to repay £5,000 on that £60,000 that they've borrowed. Somebody earning up here, the very highest earners, they're going to be repaying back about all of what they've borrowed. It's a huge difference. Everyone comes out with that 60,000. You can't predict what you're going to earn, but there's a huge subsidy built in here, huge protection for lower earners. So that 23p in the pound, which the government loses, it loses much more over here, whereas here it gets everything back that it's lent. So this is the key graph. If you want to have an argument with the government policy, this is the one you have to wrestle with. And I think this is an important graph to see, and you never see it, so I'm going to show it to you. Apologies for this. Men are green, women are grey and black. The darker colour is the new system, the lighter colour is the old system, and this is what you're likely to repay if you graduate at 22, what you'll be paying each year as you go along. Women repay far less than men on this because of the difference in lifetime's earnings, because of the time they take out of the labour market before the age of 50. But also you can see here, kind of key point, on the old system, younger people were repaying much more immediately after graduating. Here, most of the repayment burden has been put onto people from their mid-30s to their 50s, when they should be better able to repay it. So my one bit of, pretend to be Martin Lewis for a moment and give you a bit of consumer credit advice. If you know anybody who's thinking about going to university and they're looking at alternatives to government-backed student loans, tell them no way. They do not have the protections that we see here, and particularly do not have the protections for women. That women on the current government scheme will repay far less, whereas if women took out an auto loan or a mortgage or other kinds of loan to pay for higher education, there would be no difference in these graphs, except for default rates in some ways. So there's a consensus on the fee loan regime for full-time study. The scheme is fair and progressive. I have some caveats there which maybe I'll return to in the questions. And maintenance support is adequate. The kind of key thing to flag up is I think if there is a crisis in the current system for undergraduate funding in England, and particularly London, it's not the tuition fee, it's where the maintenance support covers rents and cost of living. Maybe return to that in questions. That's where I think the crisis is because of this. And the other argument is that graduate disposable income should be able to support loan repayments without being burdensome. But there's no study on this. The government has never commissioned any research into what the impact of student loans is on graduate disposable income. And particularly the one I would say, if I had to do a research project on this, I expect it to hit pension participation. But again, that might be beyond the scope of this talk. Okay, so that's the general idea. This is why people believe in it. This is why you won't get a university vice-chancellor to criticise the debt that their students have, and why the higher education is seen as solved in the UK, because it's fair and progressive, the maintenance support is adequate, and the repayments for graduates of the student loans company loan are bearable. They're not onerous. The problem with the commercial debt that students may take out, overdrafts, payday loans, etc., is a different matter, but again, maybe we can talk about that in questions. So, what then is the problem for government? Why is there going to be a further phase of reform? Well, I've already flagged it up. The government is an investor, and it wants to see a return on its investment. It's giving everybody £60,000 in total, and if not more if you're doing a 4-year degree or something like that. So here's the latest figures from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, and the numbers are in billions. So in this last financial year, the UK government issued £15 billion of student loans, and by the start of the next Parliament, it will be issuing £22 to £23 billion of loans a year in new loans. It's a huge amount of money. The problem is that repayments from all the loans that have been issued in previous years, so repayments from all the loans that were issued to people starting from 1998, are only £2.6 billion a year. And they're not going to catch up with the annual outlay ever, and there's still going to be a huge gap until probably the 2040s. That means there's a shortfall, and government has to fund this shortfall, the shortfall on the bottom, by issuing debt. It has to go to the capital markets and sell treasuries. So this is the problem. Student loans are contributing to national debt. The government is really keen to get national debt under control, and there's a problem. How can they speed up those repayments? How can they control that loan outlay, what they've promised to deliver? I'll skip over that one. And the key issue is moral hazard. Up until about 2004, everybody in the Treasury and all the mainstream political parties thought that there was just a generic value in a degree. It was good for anyone to get a degree, no matter what. It would increase their productivity, they would get better earnings, and in the global economy, in the knowledge economy, it was really important for many more people to be graduates. Nobody believes this in the Treasury anymore, and this is the key breakdown of trust between the funder and the universities, is they no longer are sure of what they're getting for their investment. And so what they need is information they didn't previously have. They want to know where are the good investments and where are the bad investments. And they want to tell potential students where are the good investments and where are the bad investments, and hopefully get students to change their behavior. But if students don't change their behavior, then I would expect to see them start making some direct interventions. So there's a kind of mix of indirect and direct power that we'll see in the next few years. Indirect power through information provision, direct power through eventually withdrawing funding from certain courses. And the key term is sort of moral hazard, and Gary Becker is one of the thinkers, along with Milton Friedman, who formalized human capital theory. And here he's talking about students. Children can default on the market debt contracted for them by working less energetically or by entering occupations with lower earnings and higher psychic income. And here psychic income means something like well-being or enjoyment. He's talking about art and design subjects. That he thinks, should they loan £60,000 to people who choose the wrong kind of careers? So here's a tweet from Edwina Curry. I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to remember Edwina Curry, but she was a minister in the Conservative government. Oh, and she was on Strictly or something, wasn't she, as well, in the early seasons. This is a tweet from the 1st of February where she's mistakenly engaging with an economist, but she thinks she's talking to a media studies graduate. And she says, all those university degrees were supposed to improve productivity, but you chose media studies instead of maths, so you can't add up. I mean, this is she's still an MP? I'm not sure if she's still an MP. She's probably retired as an MP. But this is a kind of example of the thinking which you'll find if you talk to a member of Parliament. They don't think they're getting what they thought they were getting from university funding, because people are making the wrong choices. Suhail mentioned that we've kind of created a market in higher education. We have no central planning which says there's going to be 50,000 engineering graduate course places a year and 100,000 maths places. None of that's decided centrally. It all follows the student choice. But we've hit a point where the government no longer trusts the choices that students have been making. And here's this is the kind of chart that exercises people in government. It's a bit hard to read for me down here, so I'm looking at the thing. This is a survey of the numeracy and literacy skills of students in different countries amongst university students. England is right at the bottom. We have the least numerate and the least literate higher education students. Again, down there with the United States, which also charges very high tuition fees. And the conclusion of this report, which came from the same organisation, the OECD, was England sends too many students to university. They would be better off in further education, retaking maths GCSEs and maths A-level rather than getting university degrees. This is the kind of thing that people are looking at inside government. Okay, so these are my kind of general themes. Is we're moving to a credit-based model of higher education. The Treasury lends money to students to go to university, and it doesn't really understand anymore, doesn't trust anymore whether it's getting a return on its investment. It's very concerned about people making the wrong choices. Art and design is the most subsidised subject once you factor in loan repayment. It's more subsidised than medicine, it's more subsidised than engineering, science and technology, all those subjects which still have some high-cost teaching grant, because art graduates do not earn enough money to repay their loans. So those of you who are currently worrying about the teaching excellence framework, I'm probably talking to a handful of people in the room, it's this stuff that's in the next phase of the teaching excellence framework, graduate earnings rather than NSS submissions. And I'll skip over this, except for this bottom bit. The question people want to know, and this is where they want the information from student loans, is how much should this applicant from this district at this city who went to this school, who got these qualifications, how much should we lend to them if they want to study a particular course at a particular university? That's what they want. They want an information on likely loan repayments on what they lend. And as I said, a good university is going to be one that produces graduates able to repay more and pay higher income tax. So I'm going to conclude, because I think I've got about five minutes left, by showing you some of the pilot data on this. The government's put in place a whole load of legislative changes which finally mean it's able to publish data by course and institution looking at graduate earnings, and we'll get that in the next couple of months. But we already have some pilot data, and I'll show you about it. And it will show you the problem for the creative arts. Okay, here's the David Willetts, the former minister responsible for higher education. I expect that in the future, as the data accrue, the policy debate will be about non-repayment rate for individual institutions, the actual exchequer risk from lending to students at specific universities. A few months later, he repeated the point. Imagine in the future that we discover that the non-repayment rate for a Bristol graduate was 10%, so they repay 90p in the pound that they're lent. Maybe some other university, we're only going to get 60% back. Going beyond that, it becomes an interesting question to what extent you can incentivize universities to lower their own non-repayment rates. That's what it means. David Willetts, enthusiastic for this idea and put in place all of the stuff that enables the data I'm about to show you. They had to change legislation about Her Majesty's revenue and custom data, which is previously protected. Okay. This is the individual net lifetime benefit for undergraduate degrees. This is the first survey they did of this in 2010-11. This is men are in blue, women are in red. Here is creative arts and design. This is not a mistake. Men are the wrong side. Men are the wrong side of the zero because they never earn enough over their lifetimes to make up for the fact they took 3 years out to do a degree at 18. They never make up that investment. Women see a return, but not very much. So that's, from your perspective, if you're an 18-year-old with a certain number of A-levels, should I go to university? What's the benefit I'm likely to see in terms of higher income, net of student loan repayments and net of taxes? So taxes and student loan repayments are taken out of this. You know, medicine and dentistry, you probably knew that was a good career option. Law is looking pretty good for men. Economics is extremely good for women. Being a vet, creative arts and design is a problem. And this is obviously correlated to student loan repayments. These people don't repay their student loans either. Okay, now the important thing to realise is that there's an awful lot of art and design students. We're not talking about a small group. We're talking about the 4th or 5th biggest number of undergraduates in the UK. I make that from that graph. The blue is undergraduate men and undergraduate women. I make that about 150, 160,000 undergraduates, compared to agriculture and veterinary science, and in particular compared to maths. Look how small maths is. The government would far prefer everybody did maths degrees or engineering degrees. And in some countries, you know, they would make you do those courses if you had the grades, or they would make sure there weren't so many places for social studies, which includes media studies, things like that. So it's not just that it's not a good investment for the individual. The government's giving £60,000 a year to hundreds of thousands of people. And here's the first data that I'm talking about. So this was done by a combination of Cambridge academics and Institute for Fiscal Studies academics, published last year. These are people who graduated in 2002 and have had 10 years in the labour market. This is what they're earning depending on what subject they're studying. This is what's called a box plot. So what this is showing you is it's taking all the graduates, and the box shows this is 75% of the graduates earn under this. This is the median, so this is the midpoint, the 50th percentile, and this is below here is 25% of graduates are below this. Again, you can see the similar thing. Economics is very, very good. Agriculture is very bad, but there are very few agricultural students. Creative art and designs, the average graduate in their early 30s is only earning £20,000 a year. That's less than the median wage and less than non-graduates in many regards. A similar study just come out in December, looking at 2003-4 graduates 10 years after, found very similar stats, except they've got the box plot is even lower for the 25% quartile. And this is because this one includes the self-employed. So the field of art and design have lots of self-employed people. They earn very little. And just sort of a final graph. This is comparing all graduates from all universities. So in the economics, we've got everybody from Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Economics to Bradford and other places. Creative Art and Design, this is University of Arts London, Goldsmiths, Northumbria, De Montfort, everybody wrapped up in here. So there's an awful lot of variance even within the subjects because we think it matters which institution you go to. Now we don't have that data yet, but that data is promised in a couple of months. We have had it for law graduates. This is a bit of a horrible graph that I can't get on the screen very well because it's got every university and it's doing the same thing. It's plotting the median earning for 2008-9 law graduates 5 years after leaving university. So you can see if you went to Oxford, I think that's about 60,000 for the median and 30,000 over there. I'll see if I can get that bit clearer actually. Is that legible? You can see the scale here. So look, this is the upper quartile for University of Oxford, £70,000 5 years after leaving, 5 years after graduating. But if you do the same degree law at Bradford, Derby, Buckinghamshire University, University of Wolverhampton, we're talking about something very different. The government's going to make it a requirement for all universities to publish this information by course and as part of the key information skills data that you look at when you apply. And the hope is that students will look at this data and go, maybe I don't want to study there because their graduates don't seem to do very well. This is particularly an issue for places like, where's Liverpool? Can't quite see it, but somewhere in the middle when it should be somewhere higher up. Oh, this is because I haven't got everyone on here. The graph is too big, so it's actually hiding some of the universities. But you can imagine they start publishing this for creative art and design. We're going to see similar spreads. It might be, Goldsmiths and University of Arts London might do okay, but nobody knows. But it's a whole new ball game. And this is what I mean by this sort of the financial exercise of indirect power. All this information is made available by student loans. You can't get this data unless you have data on loan repayment, because you can't create the data set without having a loan account. But at the same time, they're hoping that people will make different choices by publishing it and require universities to make this public. Okay, so I will stop at this point with this. Okay, one final graph just to show you the issue. This is a different survey, just to emphasize the point about repaying student loans. These are 2005 graduates in 2012. Creative Arts and Design, only 19% of student loans have been repaid, and that's on the old, much lower fee loan system. So the average is 34%. Art and Design is barely, just over half the average. Okay, so skip that and just think the conclusion. Oops. It's extremely costly to undo what the English have put in place here, and nobody wants to undo it because it seems to have solved certain long-running problems, particularly this end to rationing. There are going to be direct pressures on students, particularly around maintenance, costs of living, rents, commercial debt. I think there's not enough talk in the public about this, and it's really not clear what the direct pressures on graduates are in terms of repaying commercial and student loan debt simultaneously. And as I said, the government has never commissioned any research into this. But the key policy and political issue is going to be much more fundamental, in a certain sense, for the future of particular kinds of higher education provision, which is loans non-repayment. For me as an individual, if I don't repay my student loan, That's not a bad thing, perhaps. It doesn't really affect me either way. If I never earn over 21,000, I never repay my student loan, I never have to think about it, that's not a problem for me as an individual. But if all of my peers are like that, then it becomes a problem for future potential art and design students. Because why would the government give £60,000 to hundreds of thousands of people if they're not going to ever repay it? What's it getting in return? That's, I think, is the kind of the crisis coming for fine art, other subjects in this category. They don't have a very good narrative about why this is, what should be done. And so to put it bluntly, what I'm setting out to you is I think the next question will be the government will start explicitly talking about whether it continues to support university-level study in fine arts, particularly whether it's going to fund 150,000 or maybe only 50,000. Will it be a subject you can do anywhere at any institution in the country, or will it be restricted to elite institutions? In many ways, you might see more elitism arise in fine art, the study of fine art, than you do in any other subject, because the classic defence, certainly from somewhere like Central St Martin's or University of Arts London, where I work, is our graduates will not look like this. Our graduates will be at the other end of the table in high-profile jobs, and we can point to celebrity graduates. The question is whether art and design will continue to be a mass higher education subject, or just something that's in very particular pockets. Okay, sorry, I went over time a bit there.
So let's. I see there's one question already in place, but let me start with the big question. This is an impossible situation for arts and designs in universities, right? It's just not going to work. I mean, the elite model seems to be the only viable one, but given, especially in art and like our kind of contemporary art moment, there just isn't the money for people to be earning from their degrees in the field. So you either need degrees that will make people more suitable for work in other fields, like transferable skills kind of subjects, or you need to increase the amount of money that people are going to earn on a regular basis, rather than the exception of hotshot stars within the arts. Given that it's a kind of unviable economy from the side of government, what am I going to ask? What the fuck? It seems like something has to change quite dramatically, either within the arts economy to make education viable, or within art education to make it viable for students, to make the courses continue. You said at the beginning that there would be a risk or a chance of transferring higher education in the arts to further education, which is already under maybe this is what the move to Deptford, because we've moved to Lesoko, right, in Lewisham Southwark College because of the work in the arts, but maybe like we're there ahead of the curve. So we've already done the transfer on a kind of like sneak it in while we can.
I don't have any clear solutions to this. I mean, I think you effectively have a perfect storm, which is that the government has decided very explicitly on one particular way of funding higher education, but at the same time, it no longer trusts universities. Mm-hmm. So it wants much more information, and the kind of information that we've never had before. And it doesn't actually want information from academics. It doesn't want to know what you teach. It only wants to see the outcomes. And the outcome it's interested in is graduate jobs, graduate level jobs, so graduate and earnings, because the fundamental tenet is this is why we fund it. I mean, it's neoclassical economic ideology. We work in a free market, therefore you're rewarded with your wages, and your wages are proportionate to how skilled and adept you are, and that's what the training is providing. But it's quite clear, if you go into certain industries like education, teaching, where your pay has been held down for years, or you move into casual, or very casualized, like in education. Education is going to have this problem as well. There's no fit, and what can you do? Can you go to employers and say, well, you've got to stop, you've got to start paying people properly, otherwise we may lose the provision that you rely on for your base. So we have a lot of PR at the moment around the creative industries and how much value the creative industries provide to the country. But there's a lot of problems in that, largely because the creative industries includes software and includes advertising and isn't populated solely by creative arts and design graduates. It's populated by, you only have to look at the BBC. Those people come well-paying, well-earning, high-earning people in other in those industries come from other degree subjects, by and large. So you've got a fundamental kind of a structural problem that has no easy fit. And then the question is, well, what do you do? I mean, some of the people who might be familiar with the defences of arts and humanities since 2012, we know there's a kind of sector solidarity defence, that we're sort of defending the provision wherever it is. But that doesn't seem to be, that may not be successful. It may be that the high-end, the London institutions will have to effectively defend the terrain by pulling up the drawbridge and saying, our graduates are not like those other graduates, so we shouldn't be caught up in this narrative. We have to devise a different narrative. But it's not a pleasant position. There isn't.
But even the elite institutions.
Yeah.
I mean, it does seem to me that a lot of this government's policy, and the previous one as well, is directed towards producing kind of elitism through mechanisms. It's not a policy directed, like picking out certain universities as worth more than others. You let the market kind of set out elite institutions, and of course, by weird coincidence, they just happen to be the old elite institutions, which is the Oxbridge, UCL, Russell Group. But even with the elite institutions in art and design, the graduates aren't going to be earning.
We don't know yet. That's the.
Are you okay?
So we have no one's seen the data yet.
Right.
Well, no one publicly has seen the data, as far as I'm aware, and it will be published soon. And you have all manner of issues there, because it's probably going to drill down to different courses in some institutions. Yeah. You have very high-profile courses like MA Fashion at University of Arts London, at Central St Martin's, which has clear track record of putting its graduates into the top end of the industry, but it doesn't take very many students. It's not mass provision. It's very particular, small, effectively small-scale provisions, and similarly with things like the acting courses at Central St Martin's,
so
that are very, very selective. Take very few students and get loads of applications a year, and people end up in particular careers, and they can point to that. But the real worry is mass provision. I mean, if we're a believer in a kind of much wider access to higher education, then that is not, it's not, you can't roll out MA Fashion because they've captured a certain aspect of the job market.
So you would have, just before the question, just to kind of get an overall picture. So you would have not just the elitization of institutions across the country. And this is all at undergraduate level, these funding figures, right? I mean, there's a little bit on top for postgraduate, but the main government investment through tuition fees is through the loans to undergraduates. So given this logic, you'd have the elitization of the institutions, but even within the institutions, the more likely prospect is for a shrinking and becoming more elite of the courses, because that way you can guarantee future revenues.
The best way to improve your future earnings profiles of your graduates is to change the students you select.
Yeah.
The other aspect of this research I've put on the board shows that there's a persistent effect. People from high-earning families are earning £8,000 to £10,000 a year more than people from poorer backgrounds. So if you on this law chart here, what this shows is that the universities at this end are by and large taking private school educated, much better off students, and that's partly a factor of why you get that stratification. So yep. So if you could, if you basically said, well, we've got some courses which are really good, and some courses that are not so good, we'll close the courses that are not so good, which take the high-end students, and then we'll, all our averages will be boosted. That's a real risk in this kind of system, is that it isn't the case that we're in a free market where productivity is what gives you the reward of higher earnings. It's very, some of these institutions are sending much people into the city. So what you can imagine is that people at Oxford and people at LSE, it's not that they're creating much, much better lawyers, it's that those graduates are going into the jobs in the city. And that's a very different
Because that's
structure.
the frame.
Yeah.
Can I just make one more point? Because I know there's like more and more questions, which is good. But the point I was going to make around this elitization all the way through is that for our sector, that suits very well the model of the prestigious MFA kind of going into the blue chip sector. So you end up with a kind of narrowing of who comes into the art field and also what comprises the art field in general.
Yes.
Because you still need the MFA as a kind of accreditation for the art world, but that accreditation is for very much fewer people, and the kind. I mean, it would suit the universities essentially in terms of reporting to this model, to kind of have the MFA blue chip kind of circuit as tight as possible, which presumably suits those galleries as well as a kind of looking to art schools essentially as a kind of triage mechanism to select the emerging.
Yeah, sifting.
Yeah. All right. So there's a question here. Can I just see? There's one, two. There's one. Okay. I'll take these questions. I'll take the first ones one at a time, and then see yours as well. I'll take the first ones one at a time, and then we'll go and take 3 or 4 at a time as we go along. So do you want to ask yours?
Yeah.
And also because there's a lot of questions, can you keep them brief? Not like
You
mine.
mentioned that what the government, the funding is based on, the government's thinking is that what's going to get out of, funding the institutions. So I recently read a report that says that the art, the creative sector within UK generates about 84.1 billion for the UK economy, and more than 9.1 million pounds an hour. And so why is not the government taking that? Because that's really
You want to take a few,
generating a lot of resources for the economy. It's almost, it clearly states that it's help in pushing
Okay, we get it.
the UK economy out of the crisis.
Okay, I need to repeat questions because people at the back may not hear
sure.
them. So the question was reading a report that
The Creative Industries Federation report
okay.
on the contribution of the creative industries to the UK economy.
You should tell me what the question is. Basically, it's 84 billion per year.
And 9.6
And-
million per hour.
And 9.6 million per hour is coming from creative sectors into the UK, so it's a viable economy. Why isn't this being touted as contributing to the kind of returns the government's
But
interested
that's precisely the report I had in mind when I was saying that the creative industries is not creative arts and design. Creative industries includes software development, includes advertising, it includes the BBC, which is not full of people who've done design and art degrees, and it's full of people who've come from these institutions as well. So that's why it's very hard to make the case, because once you start drilling into that figure, it's very clear we're not talking about creative arts and design. We're talking about a much broader category that includes lots of different graduates who've done lots of different subjects, and often dominated by these, in certain institutions, dominated by these kind of graduates as well, law graduates and English graduates, not by people who've done fine art at De Montfort, for example.
Yeah, so like the BBC is full of people who have read English at Oxford, who that product gets sold across the world, counts as part of that economy, but it's not to do with our immediate subject. There's a question here.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering how this data corresponds to postgraduate courses as well, since it's kind of only taking into account what people will earn when they've done a certain undergraduate degree, whereas first of all, people might be switching. I think people are funneled much more into business and law after maybe doing an English undergrad.
Okay, so is there more?
No, I guess
It's fine if there isn't. So the question was how do postgraduate programs fit into this data, because people who do arts and designs at undergraduate can switch to English or other kind of more
or
vocational.
even it's value enhancing if you have more.
Yes.
So it's
Okay.
value
This is raw data. It's not controlled for anything. So it includes people who've gone on and got postgraduate qualifications, MAs, PhDs. All it's looking at is what undergraduate subject did they study. So the government is being a bit irresponsible, because it's just chucking out a whole load of raw data. There's no information here on what the qualifications people had when they entered, what sex they are, what social class they come from, what further qualifications they went on to. It's just sticking out a whole load of raw data and requiring universities to publish it. So it's pretty irresponsible in that sense. It's not showing value add, shall we say. You can't, we can't yet do a kind of cross-reference analysis on what's going on at this end compared to what's going on at this end, given the different kind of students they have.
And it's also only showing you the data of those people who do have loans.
Exactly, yeah.
Because
Yeah, so
So the question was,
those from the very wealthiest background, the top 10% don't take out loans. So in the UK, 90% of eligible students take out loans. So the top 10%, the very wealthiest, they're not even in this data.
all right, so there was a question over here. Can I just see if there's
Yeah.
more? You've already asked one, so okay, I'll take yours.
Yeah, since some of this information is going to be published and made available to sort of prospective students, like information about graduate earnings, what kind of efforts are being made in like secondary and further education to persuade students to make the right choice?
Okay, so the question is, what's the training for students in, and presumably parents of students in secondary and further education to make what would be called the right choice?
Let's try and take a few. And
Okay,
I'll
all right.
come back to
And
that
then, and then, did you have one more? Yeah.
It seems that thinking about the future of arts education or something creative like that seems obviously really tied into this rethinking this idea of productivity. And I'm just wondering what you think the introduction of something like universal basic income might have on this situation.
Okay.
Yeah, I like the idea that Gary Becker's psychic income.
Yeah.
So what is the case for why not just drop arts and design? What's the case for psychic income in the context of this kind of great productivity?
All right. So the first question was, sorry, I'll repeat it anyway. How do people make informed choices as they come into higher education, both students and their parents? Second question was, these last two are kind of related because the argument is based on productivity and returns. How would a policy like universal basic income affect the fundamental logic for the very construction of this kind of schema? Because Will Davis was kind of rehearsing the arguments around this way neoliberalism provides a kind of market solution, or lets the market make the politics in a way rather than inform policy choices. UBI just wipes out returns as a condition for policy making. And then the Roman's question was, this is all very, I paraphrase, this is all very convincing. Why not just wipe out art and design? Because the site where the returns are is in what Gary Becker calls psychic investment?
Psychic income.
Psychic income.
Yeah.
But if that can't be figured up in these kinds of graphs, or maybe we need graphs for psychic income, you can get to work on that with degree show. Why not just kind of like accept the case, and maybe have a totally, which is a dream actually for a lot of art theory and art politics, just de-educationalize or kind of take art education out of the formal sector.
Yeah, okay, so let me just do this first one. It's always been going back to 2010, there was a huge promise from the government that they would introduce an overhauled career service into sixth forms and schools as part of the reforms to higher education, and they've never managed to achieve that. It's probably the biggest failing. They really have this problem in that they have to, it's extremely complicated, I don't know how many people who've been to all 140 universities in this country or tried out all the different courses in order to make a choice, but the idea of markets is basically that you become an informed consumer. Now, if I like baked beans, I can go to the supermarket each week and choose a different can of beans until I find the one I like. I cannot do that with higher education. I only get kind of one shot at it through the loan scheme. So what I have to use instead is I have to use information as a proxy for that kind of consumerist behaviour. In the same way that consumer affairs magazines will give you lots of information about fridges and washing machines by doing the testing and you rely on their judgment. The idea is that we put a whole load of new information about higher education into the public domain, and people will make choices based on that information they never had before. So the idea will be that this information will be published on websites. But in a sense, the other thing that the government's keen on this data is it thinks it will undercut misplaced prestige. So lots of people have various ideas about universities, but they're normally extremely out of date. We're still obsessed in this country about which of these universities are former polytechnics, even though that happened 25 years ago. But you can see on this data that the University of Exeter is very high up. The University of Surrey is very high up. The University of Kent, City University, these aren't Russell Group universities. These universities would be very keen on this data and for this course because it shows that they're competing with the fake prestige of the Russell Group. So in some ways, there's going to be lots of competing information that people have, and the idea is shining a light better into what's going on to help people make the choice. So that would be my sort of answer to the first one. Might be a bit unsatisfactory.
The question was about how people are trained to kind of understand.
Well, they won't understand it immediately, but they'll soon learn to, and things like the Times Good University Guide and Which magazine will start writing articles on how to interpret this data. That's the idea.
Since state school students are more likely to be lower earners, do you reckon like the presentation of this cold economic data will probably be done predominantly there to try and discourage potential state school students to cause a debt problem?
Well, there's a problem in state schools, for example, because in their league tables they're measured on how many students they send to Russell Group. And this data says, as I've just said, shows you something not quite like that, because it's showing you that the Russell Group doesn't have a monopoly.
You may want to say what the Russell Group is.
The Russell Group is a self-selected group of the top 24 universities in the country. It's a club, basically. And universities like Kent have applied to be in the Russell Group and have been rejected, for example. So this is the issue. The information is not going to give a neat story, and different information is going to convey different things. My sense is that this information is going to be much more of interest to people than whether it's a Russell Group place. And so the school might be pushing one line because they're going to get judged on it, and the students will be looking at something else. But you can see that this would also, if you're thinking about doing law, but you're also interested in the arts, you might go, well, I'll do my law degree, earn a lot of money before 30, then I retire and I can pursue my interest in the arts. Suddenly certain things get you get a different perspective on things. You know, rather than these vague ideas of careers, you suddenly see that it actually makes quite a big difference, and a kind of concrete difference. Because we're looking at tens of thousands of graduates in this data. This is big data, basically. This is a big data revolution, as well as a student loans revolution. Productivity. Productivity is really the key. I mean, it's you can't really get a good answer from economists about what productivity is. In a certain sense, it's a statistical artifact. You measure output and you measure hours worked, and you divide output by hours worked, and that's productivity. I mean, what in a certain sense is it? You know, it's a statistical artifact. It's what you're left with when you do a certain kind of numerical analysis, but it depends on measuring hours worked and measuring output in a clear way. In general, it's really operating here as an ideological belief. It's operating that this is what happens in our economy. You are rewarded for your skills, and if you're in teaching, for example, and you're only earning £20,000 a year, you would, if you could, switch to law and earn £40,000 a year. But if you don't do that, it's because you can't, because you haven't got the skills. You know, it kind of makes no allowance for people who go into, say, public interest law rather than city law, or do family law rather than tort or property law. You know, all these choices, even within law, get obscured here. And the question is, well, what in the end do we mean by productivity? But that would take us all the way back to questions of classical political.
It was a UBI question. So.
Well, this is why I was going back to the 18th century, because in many ways, Will Davis is really the person to talk about this. In a certain sense, there's always been a moral objection to the universal basic income, in that it means that people won't strive anymore. They will privilege their well-being over their working, and people just believe it will have a bad effect on the economy because people won't have to go out and work. Now, it depends what kind of economist you are. If you think that what's driving the macroeconomy is aggregate demand, universal basic income has a very different flavour for you. If you think what matters is strivers going out and working hard and producing, then you don't like universal basic income. And I've kind of caricatured it, but I'm not sure it's any more nuanced than that in many regards. That if you were to have universal basic income, most people, a lot of the current government would think, well, everyone would just not get out of bed in the morning, and and be perpetual students and never leave a certain lifestyle and produce for the economy.
But this is a good defence then, if you're interested in art and design, and sort of keeping, sort of maintaining the stuff that isn't kind of value added, in terms of this kind of data-led or accounting mechanisms. UBI seems a good point of intervention to kind of break away from the whole logic of these kinds of structures.
I think that's a debate to be had. I'm not sure we could. Okay. I'm really the person who can pursue that. But I think there's an important point to make about psychic income or well-being. I mean, these human capital theorists are quite interesting in many ways, and they do think about. Basically, their whole problem is why do we invest our time in different ways? This is really how they approached economics differently. And you can invest your time in producing earnings, or you can invest your time improving your psychic income. The other thing they were really interested in, as well as education, was migration. For them, a human capital investment is emigrating. Leaving one country for another is a classic example of human capital investment. But the problem is, in the end, when you put it in terms of a loan economy, then it doesn't. The government can't pay its way with the well-being of its country. Unless you have another kind of sophisticated argument on top about how well-being boosts productivity or things like that. I mean, I think they're much more concerned, particularly in England. Were we seeing, the kind of growth rates you're seeing in China, then there might be more concern for well-being. But our economy is effectively stagnating, and people don't know if it's a post-crash effect or if it's some kind of secular, profound transformation in capitalism, and they're going to try and throw a lot of things at it. And one of the things they're going to review is, well, what we did in the 90s to send all these people to university hasn't worked in the way we thought it was, so we need to review that first.
But I wonder if you could make a case for...
Me personally?
I mean, it seems like that was something you thought was a good idea, arts and design. Is it, or is the government right?
So Una, are you asking to include psychic investments with it? Okay, that's the case should be made for psychic investments.
Okay, so
as part of this economy.
Okay. Well, there's a kind of argument which goes like this. So I've met Joe Johnson, the Minister for Higher Education, or I've met the Chancellor, and they're not Philistines. They like art. They go to the opera. They go to museums. They read books. I mean, not all of them do this, and obviously our current culture minister is a classic example of a Philistine. But the issue is that you will always get this argument, and in many ways, one of the best things to look at is the opera, and to think about the stuff I've shown you with music. Music is a degree that's in the creative arts and designs. It's included in these figures I've shown you. If anyone's ever been a freelance musician, or knows anyone who is in the orchestra pit at the English National Opera anyway, their terms and conditions are terrible. It's one of the most casualised industries with very little paid gigs to make it worthwhile, and an awful lot of training. You have to boost your music productivity an awful lot to be a professional musician. You have to put in years of training, but it's not seen in terms of rewards. Maybe one of the strongest arguments to put to ministers is, the logic of your argument is that we would stop funding music degrees, and then you would kind of run out of musicians, particularly because you're not going to be able to bring them in from the EU and overseas, as you have been doing for the last few years.
Or you have an entirely privatised or off-state arts and design.
But that's why opera is important to look at, because it still has like this enormous subsidy effectively written into its constitution, that the Arts Council funds opera way beyond its popularity as an art form, which we can trace back to John Maynard Keynes, who set up the Art Council and was a huge patron of ballet and opera. Okay,
I can see 3 questions, and you had a question. You've been very patient. So do you want to go first? I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll just let's take 3, and then we'll do another 3 at the end. Okay, good. So go ahead.
My question is related to the last one.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I can repeat.
I just thought that it's kind of ironic that we're all here in this restructured well-being kind of a system that's basically, like creating the whole thing. Do you hear me? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's
What I don't understand. So the
No,
question is that there's an irony
yeah.
or a...
No, let's take another. I
Okay,
know
all
I
right.
understand the question. I think.
And
Yeah.
then, so you had a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So in about 10 years ago, Nesta was, one of their rally calls was the MFA is the new MBA.
Yeah,
And there was
STEAM.
it was a period of like a lot of investment in the creative economy and access to loans for creative businesses. And it strikes me that at the same time as all these changes are happening, a lot of those loans dried up. And those sort of, if we contrast like arts education with law education, like the law industry is able to accept new graduates in a more elastic way than the arts industry is, which relies on graduates actually starting up their own businesses. So is there a sort of post-education reform that we need to start thinking about, which might actually make art grads profitable for the government?
Okay, then there was a question.
Oh, yeah, and I was just like interested in the comparison you made, refer to the idea of productivity.
Yeah.
And with immigration and education, I was wondering whether you could tell something more, maybe as well thinking about the idea that many students, when they study, they have to leave the country where they study because they cannot afford the lifestyle and they eventually migrate back.
Okay, so I'll go to them in reverse order, and then we'll have another bunch of questions. So the last question was about migration and productivity, and whether people move around internationally. This is kind of what this program is about. Whether people move around internationally in order to kind of meet whatever their needs are, which affects, I guess, these kind of productivity calculations. The question over here was about a statement a few years ago from National Endowment for Science, Technology,
in the
Arts
arts, yeah.
in America.
No, here.
In here?
Yeah.
Here. Which the slogan was the MFA's new MBA, because economies are becoming creative economies. But that hasn't really panned out very well in terms of earnings for graduates from those programs. And whether, as I understood it, the question was whether we need to also look at post-education sectors and reimbursements or remunerations.
Can I?
Sure.
It's more about access to loans afterwards.
Oh, okay.
As a law grad, you don't really need another loan to start your
Yeah.
law firm because the industry can accept you.
Okay.
Whereas with arts grads, there's an expectation that you can be starting your own.
So you need a post-education financial
Yeah.
support mechanism
Yeah.
to kind of make it viable for the startup, for example, to go through the first, like that early bump.
And then try
That-
out with the GOC.
Okay, and then the first question in this series was about the bitter irony of a talk like this on a program like this, which I didn't quite understand. what
No,
that
I
was,
mean,
but-
can I deal with the first?
Sure.
And I don't mean deal with it in a casual way at all. No, I absolutely agree. We should be uncomfortable talking about this, and anyone who has a post in a university as an academic, you should be looking at them going, well, how do you personally benefit from this? I mean, the enthusiasm for this system amongst university administrators and staff is that they didn't have their jobs cut. They didn't have to have their pay slashed. The shift to grad student debt has protected academic staff. They've got, they are benefiting from this system. And I think we should be far more uncomfortable, and I don't have a permanent, I'm a casualised academic. I only work a few days a week on hourly paid contracts. Most of the time I'm a freelance writer. I think we should be far more uncomfortable, particularly in London, about student rents and cost of living. That's where I get really worried. I get really worried when I hear about students who are commuting in from Salisbury or Winchester because they can't afford rent, or who are taking out payday loans. I mean, I know of universities where they think 1 in 8 students is using payday loans to get through undergraduate education. That's pretty terrible. But in a certain sense, the sector has turned a blind eye to it because it's too difficult to question, and because universities are too bound up in this. The reason why student rents have doubled in the last 10 years is because universities have used third-party companies to build their student accommodation. The reason student rents have gone through the roof is because they're using private finance initiative, design build finance operate, they're using sale and lease back, they're using all these methods to build a student accommodation, so it's not on their own balance sheet. And that means rents have to track and drive market rents. And universities are fundamentally complicit in this, and we should be, student rent campaigns in London are fundamentally important. I know I tread a thin line with my presentation, and I really want to sort of say that what I hope to achieve from that is sort of explain why policymakers are so pleased with this system. This isn't a temporary system. This is now the new permanent state of affairs in England, and people are proud of it, and they think they're going to sell it around the world. They think we're going to sell this to the US because the US has a completely different kind of graduate debt problem. We should be profoundly uncomfortable with this, but also understand what they're trying to do and what happens next. And I think that there's a danger in the creative arts, which will lead on to this second question, that it bought into this bullshit Britain idea from the late 90s, early 2000s, where the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts and the Royal Society of Arts were completely bound up in this new Labour Blairite vision that we would be sort of a leading creative knowledge economy, using the acronym STEAM. It's not science, technology, engineering and maths, it's science, technology, engineering, arts and maths, and pushing an entrepreneurial vision that, that arts and design graduates have lots in common with entrepreneurs, because they're basically self-employed, trying to do startups, trying to create their own jobs. They're not like these law graduates who are going into high-paid jobs in cities. They're doing something completely different. And it's really clear that in many universities, University of Arts London is one, you look at their new creative attributes, the 9 attributes which graduates are meant to have. It's all about entrepreneurialism, resilience in the face of difficulty, all these things which kind of push the problems of the economy back onto the individual, as if it's a character failing. You're not resilient enough if you can't cope in this economy. And that's fundamentally, it's not a responsible position when we know that, in fact, most self-employment is not through choice. It's not the case that there are all these alternative well-paid jobs that you could choose to do, and so that everybody who's self-employed is effectively an entrepreneur by choice. It just isn't the case. The changing nature of the labour market, particularly the labour market for people teaching and producing design and art, it's not healthy, and there's far too little attention to that. But the problem is the government doesn't want to hear that, and the universities are very worried about pushing back a message to the government that the government doesn't want to hear, because they're worried then the government will take its revenge in certain ways. It's very easy for the government to favour certain universities rather than others, particularly around things like student visas. I mean, some of you may be aware that there's a new pilot programme for international student visas, and particularly for postgraduate courses, but the 4 universities that are in the pilot are Oxford, Cambridge, Bath and Imperial. Lots of other universities would have loved to be in that pilot because you get a much better deal, your students are better treated, etc. But it's not there. Those kind of things the government can pick favourites very easily. So it's a very difficult line, I think, for universities to tread. They want to be kind of friendly, constructive criticism, when in fact, they've misunderstood what the government is trying to do. So one of the things around these ideas about the MFA as the new MBA, and this kind of vision for entrepreneurship, universities think they can respond to that, and they think they're doing what the government wants to see, and they think it will help change these profiles. If you give students more skills in those regards, then maybe you will push your students up the table. So they think it's like a win all round. But, I mean, in a certain sense, it's a shared, they're buying into a kind of vision of Britain, which is, misrecognition of what's going on. And I think it needs saying, it's horribly London-centric. I mean, the other problem we have, and particularly the problem for mass higher education, is a lot of the things that we've talked about, which are potential solutions for art and design in the face of this, it's basically London. And the real question is, what does London, what place is the sort of the dominance of London doing in this kind of policy discourse? Again, it tends to generate its own bullshit. So if you're an artist and designer operating outside of London, where do you fit in? If you're running an art school outside of London, where do you fit in? And the bottom line is you probably don't. I mean, these are all provincial cities down the bottom here, with the exception of London Metropolitan and University of East London. So I won't say any more about that. I think I've kind of tried to give a sort of more sense of my moral position on these things. The question about migration. In this kind of The human capital theory is relatively recent. It was only really developed since the 1940s, 1950s. And it depended on this new idea, which is that we would look at families and the decisions that families make in the same way we look at the decisions that companies make. And so in many ways, to understand what's going on in human capital theory, you have to imagine that you look at a family as an intergenerational firm making investment decisions. You know, the McGettigans came, you know, my grandparents came to the UK from Ireland in 1950. You know, they moved countries and migrated, and, you know, in order to have better opportunities for them and particularly for their children. In human capital theory, that's an investment, you know, an investment analogous to taking time out of the labour market and going into higher education. You know, it costs something to leave your country and come to the UK to, you know, hopefully make a better life. And it's analysed in human capital theory in almost exactly the same way. What are the returns on that investment? Is that a good investment for migrants? Do migrants who come from certain countries and go to certain other countries, when do they do better and when do they not do better? You know, it's not hard to do a similar chart for different degree subjects for migrants from different countries to different cultures. And in many ways, this is, you know, the kind of blind spot for English higher education policy, because Britain has traditionally been a net importer, shall we say, to use their language. We haven't seen mass graduate emigration. We haven't seen brain drains like we have from Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. Our EU citizens didn't, by and large, take up the opportunity to go and work in other EU countries. Most of our labour has been resolutely immobile and hasn't left to go and find work opportunities in other European countries. Instead, we've seen increased emigration into the country from EU countries and from international. And that means we're very, you know, our policymakers are choosy about which aspects of human capital theory they're interested in. If you read the smart people on this, they're the ones who are always critics of immigration controls. You know, you shouldn't have the immigration controls, but basically what you're preventing is the people with the skills coming into the country which you don't have. And, you know, personally, I think we'll see this in the NHS very quickly. I spent quite a lot of time in hospital last year. Almost every nurse I was treated by was either from the Philippines or from a European country. And that's pretty typical, I think, of London hospitals. You know, if we start actually trying to stop that form of human capital investment, we'll see the problems very quickly.
Okay, can I just see how many more questions there are? There's 2, and I have a couple to round off. Just make sure. Okay. Robbie first.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, when you're using the word productivity, I was thinking more about the word impact, and that as kind of more potentially sort of social driven work. And maybe if you could try and unpack that in terms of, you talked about the teaching
Excellence framework.
I don't know too much about that, but I know about REF. And I wondered if you could kind of comment on your position in the sense of, as far as I understand the impact, the research excellence framework was the first exercise to access the impact of research outside of academia, right? So that's the sense that it's kind of trying to address people who aren't in a privileged position and allowing them to be included. Whereas it seems as if in this framework, impact is something that kind of prohibits you because you're actually measured on that sense of impact as an institution, and you're saying whether, which is kind of quantifiable, I suppose. I wonder if you could kind of talk a little bit about impact and how you maybe push back.
Yeah, I read the other day what I thought was a bullshit article on Breitbart about women. Places for women in university should be capped because they take out so much time in maternity. But then looking at your graph and using the logic of this talk, isn't that a real danger that because their default on the loan payment is higher because they're taking time off with families, that this is the logical step to lessen places for women?
All right, so the first question was about the notion of impact, which is currently part of higher education policy, especially through research frameworks, which are a way of doing audits on. It's a similar kind of thing around research rather than sort of student productivity, and how impact sort of circulates within this sort of productivity of higher education model. And then the second question was based on a, if I may quote, a bullshit article in Breitbart. I don't know what other kind you find in
I
Breitbart.
thought it was bullshit, but it looks like it's got
Okay,
legs.
so
It sounds like
the article was that number of places of women in university should be capped because they lose a lot of money
They don't
essentially.
repay their loans.
yeah.
And they don't repay their loans, so they're not a good economic investment, basically.
Those two?
Well, there's those two.
Okay.
I'll ask some kind of round, sort of large questions. at the
Well,
end.
let's look at this chart. Let me get a perspective on it myself. So I showed this quite quickly, and I mainly show it because it's important to show that there's a lot of protection for women in the current student loan system. So if you were a prospective applicant looking at student loan company loans, and it all looks very uncertain, and government just changed the terms, and I don't really know how income contingent repayment loans work, why don't I go look at an alternative finance company which will loan me the money, or why don't I take out a mortgage and pay for my student loan that way? At least I'll then know what my commitments are. This is the kind of diagram to look at for women, because there's a huge amount of protection in this, given the huge inequalities in the labour market, which we've already talked about. So it's not, and the word I would just be careful to use is no one on this graph is defaulting. Everyone on this graph is repaying their loans in accordance with the terms of repayment. They're just not earning that much more. Whereas in America, loan default means you basically can't meet your mandatory payments. So there's a different article here. A bit of historical irony here. When David Willits was once heckled, he was the university minister who brought this in at the University of Nottingham. He was heckled by a group of women, and he said to them, well, why are you complaining? You'll never repay your loans anyway. But this is the horrible ambiguity in how these things fit into a labour market, which isn't a labour market structured around a free market where the reward is high productivity and where domestic responsibilities and other activities impinge on this vision. Now, we're very lucky not to be in the America of Donald Trump. This does not have legs in Britain. You couldn't run this argument in Britain about we shouldn't loan money to women because they don't repay their loans. In particular, this graph is the one that always gets cited in return. All women benefit from doing a degree, whereas not all men do. And even something for historical and philosophical studies, and I'm a philosophy graduate, where there's no return either way from doing the degree as a man. There's not a mistake here either. It's just smack on zero. There's a much bigger return from women. So the investment in women doing a degree is better for the Treasury in terms of higher income tax and other aspects of things. But your question is a really important one, because politics can change very quickly. And in America, where you have a completely different kind of government, looking at higher education, the thing they'll look at immediately is, why are student loans so costly? Something I can show you that maybe is more pertinent to England. I'm sorry to throw more stuff at you, but this I don't know if we can change the lights here. This was a sort of historical anecdote. I used to have this in this PowerPoint presentation, but I took it out because it never looked relevant. This was a paragraph from the Brown Review into Higher Education from 2010, which was arguing that what you should do is you should have a test for whether people can get student loans or not, like an aptitude test, or you look at your A-level or your BTECs, and every year you'd have all these people who you can potentially fund to go to university, and you decide how many you're going to fund, and you draw a line and say, those of you with a certain UCAS tariff, which means those of you with certain kind of qualifications would be able to get loans, and other people wouldn't. And that was in the same report that recommended, the uncapping of fees from 3,000. It's the report that led to the protests in December 2010 outside Parliament. This is one of the other things it was proposing, and the government never went anywhere near it. But last week, Michael Barber, who effectively wrote this report, was made the chair of the new Office of Students, which is going to be created next year. He will be the regulator, effectively the chair of the regulatory body looking after all English higher education. So suddenly something which looked like, a really worrying proposal which the government had rejected, now we have to look at it again because this person who was working for Pearson has now been put into a regulatory chair function. So we should be worried about these things, and it's not because we should be worried about them not because they're crazy, but because there's a little kernel in there of something. I'm not going to say it's truth, but if you are only interested in whether the loans get repaid, if you were that kind of person, then that's the logic to it. But there are other arguments in favour of higher education, even ones produced by economists.
The impact question.
Yeah, I think the key term for the teaching excellence framework is outcome, not impact. And whereas before, haven't mentioned it so far, but what we would have been, actually haven't mentioned it so far, is achieving a qualification as the outcome of higher education. You're meant to get we haven't even mentioned getting a qualification in this, or learning, we haven't mentioned that. The thing about outcomes is that the government will redefine them around other things. One of the things the government has lost faith in is the way in which UK degrees are classified. Firsts, 2-1s, 2-2s, thirds, etc. Nowadays, 70% of graduates get a 2-1 or a first. 25% of graduates get a first. In the late 90s, it was 7%. The government thinks this grade inflation is one of the symptoms of misplaced trust in academics, and that they need to somehow open up what's going on to a different kind of scrutiny. And so they're not interested in the outcomes in terms of degrees. If we were 10 years ago and we were thinking about higher education the way they were thinking about schools education, you'd point to the increasing number of 2-1s and firsts, and you say, our students are better prepared and they're better taught, so their grades are improving. And the government would have used that line to show the success of its policy. The key indicator that something has changed is that nobody says that anymore. In fact, everyone says it's degree inflation, we don't trust them. It's not a sign that our investment policy's worked off, because we don't trust those traditional outcomes. We don't trust the academic outcomes. So in the teaching excellence framework, the first phase, the suite of metrics is completion rates, but that's just whether someone gets through and gets a qualification. It's not actually what qualification they have. Graduate employment and NSS satisfaction. None of those is really teaching excellence. They're all proxies for different things. But in the subsequent phase, the NSS metrics, and there are 3 of them in the first phase of the TEF, will gradually be replaced. They're only really in there because they're what we have to hand at the moment, and you don't have to do any more administrative data collecting capacity to get those metrics. We've just got them, so let's chuck them in the basket. But in future, it's the earnings metrics which will go in there. And what we'll be interested in chiefly is the outcomes that we measure under teaching excellence is earnings and graduate jobs, and some other things. We could talk a bit more about learning gain, but that's going to be something very, very different, and also something which will be really problematic for art and design. But that's just a whole different...
Okay, I've just got, I sort of feel recognise people are tired, but just to pull out a bit and to sort of draw out more general lessons in a way. Because in a way, this is typical of kind of neoliberal governance structure. You kind of produce elite effects, you let the market kind of regulate allegedly in its own terms, but you're after very specific things, and so on and so forth. There are 2 questions I had. You speak about government, but government is not a unified, a coherent thing. It's got lots of factions. Is there a part of government in the UK that's driving this, which kind of has affiliations with styles of government elsewhere? Is it more European? Is it more North American, Australian, elsewhere in the world? You don't have to answer the latter part. It's just more, I guess, is this Treasury driven? Is this driven by education? Is it driven by Prime Minister's office? Do you know?
And you said there was a second question.
The second question was, where's, just in terms of the, so we don't leave feeling totally hopeless and, inept in terms of what to do, where would be the site of intervention for politics of this? In a way, from the cultural sector, we don't have, generally speaking, we don't have the technical know-how, we're not economically adept kind of produce counter-arguments like this, but there's obviously some of the discussion has been around counterclaims or other psychic, I can't remember the term, psychic income, whether that's a kind of policy that needs to be developed, or whether it needs to be situated at government, whether it needs to be situated thinking of other markets, or whether, something that's come up from the discussion is that, well, the inevitable outcome of this is going to be the removal of advanced art and design education from the university sector. So maybe more things like Open School East, and start thinking about those as possibilities to kind of compensate for the destruction of this sector in higher education. I mean, that's quite dramatic, but just to give some vim at the end. But just where to intervene politically, rather than just kind of be railroaded by technocratic commands.
Well, let's start with this question on factions, because I think partly sometimes it's understanding the factions where you can see that there are different sites of intervention. And I don't think there's just one, but they're different, and I'm not going to give any of them any particular privilege. Under the coalition government, because it was a coalition to some extent, there were an awful lot of factions that you could play on. But there was also a kind of key faction between the Business Innovation and Skills Department, which was where universities were based, who were relatively pro-immigration, particularly student immigration, saw higher education as an export industry. So it's our sixth or seventh largest export industry, universities. We bring so many students into the country that counts as a very significant export. And they had a perpetual battle with the Home Office. The Home Office was run by Theresa May. Theresa May was beholden to this pledge to get net migration down below 100,000, and the easiest hit was seen to be students, particularly students at English language colleges and further education colleges, but also universities. And there were an awful lot of arguments behind the scene. I mean, if you're particularly interested in that, then there's several places you can see it erupt, particularly around what happened at London Metropolitan University in 2012. But in a certain sense, David Cameron was not particularly he wasn't particularly ideologically fixated. He was very pragmatic, and he would listen to the arguments and let them kind of play out in cabinet. And the Treasury were much more interested in this problem of funding universities and trying to find out which universities they should be funding. But the problem is they had this very particular historical legacy, which means they couldn't do what they wanted to do in one blow. The problem we have now is that it's not just that we've just got a Conservative administration rather than a Conservative Lib Dem administration, and you have to realise so much stuff didn't happen under the coalition because of the student fees protests in 2010. So if you want to start thinking about one-sided intervention, the reason we didn't have a higher education bill in 2012 or 2013 was because the Lib Dems were not interested. They didn't want to open up that whole problem of what happened outside Parliament in December 2010. In many ways, the problem we have now is we don't really have the headline policy to organise around, and in the same way we did with fees going up to £9,000. But the other problem is there are very few factions, and Theresa May was in the Home Office, and now she is Prime Minister. And in fact, most of the power, I would say, is coming from her office in a way that didn't happen under David Cameron, when most of the stuff, George Osborne was more of a thinker than David Cameron, and you had a different kind of set of factions in the cabinet. The problem is we have a very regressive person, I would say, in Theresa May. She's interested in bringing back grammar schools. She has a very traditional idea of international students. I mean, she basically thinks only deserving international students should come into the country, as if you were charity cases, as if you couldn't get an education in your own country, so that we should organise how we bring students in the country on the basis of which ones deserve it, and in particular concentrate on getting them into good universities. And again, this will be another kind of aspect of policy, is you'll see much more of a clamp down on international students at the less good universities, in the way that the Home Office understands it. It's very hard to see the factions, because in many ways the faction in the Conservative Party that would have been a certain kind of ally for political intervention has been smacked down by the Brexit vote. The faction of the Conservative Party that was, in favour of remaining in the EU, and there was a significant number of Conservative MPs were campaigning for remaining. You probably forget that now because they've all gone totally quiet. They're the same kind of people who are the more progressive wing of the Conservative Party and were more, allies in policy arguments. They don't have the same power or standing they had before. I mean, Theresa May has really dominated this space in the Conservative Party. So, I think it's really always quite important to pay attention to those things. I think it's a really good question, but it's really unclear where they are. And obviously, there's, what organised opposition there is in Parliament is, the Labour Party obviously has its particular problems, but the SNP have a very different position on this because higher education is a devolved issue. There are no tuition fees in Scotland. Scotland is deliberately differentiating itself from England. And in many ways, it's very difficult for the SNP to even be involved in votes about English higher education because of the, evil English votes for English laws, right. English voting on English laws. So that's difficult at the moment. There's very little. I mean, the House of Lords is a different case, but we probably don't want to go down that route. So in a certain sense, I think a lot of the stuff coming through is going to come through quite quickly, particularly once the Higher Education Research Bill gets established and we get the Office for Students created. Then I think an awful lot will happen quite quickly. But things like the Teaching Excellence Framework on all these kinds of information provisions don't require the primary legislation. It doesn't matter if the Higher Education Research Bill goes through or not for us to have to live with Teaching Excellence Framework or for this data to be published. That's all happening. The key things happened in the last Parliament on those. So yes, I mean, it's hard to see then what to do. And universities are in a difficult position. What most universities will do is they'll adopt a PR strategy. They'll champion in their courses which do well on those metrics, and they'll think long and hard about the other courses. And then that's a case of you have to organise in your own institution around that, because often the issue with policy is not what the government can't just impose things on universities given the structure, and often the worst kinds of things that happen are because the management goes into paroxysms and tries to anticipate what the government would like to see and tries to think it knows which way the wind's blowing and then introduces a whole load of really regressive changes. That's, I think, when I say the universities don't have a good narrative around the creative arts academics don't have a good narrative around the creative arts, and the unions certainly don't have any position on this at the moment. So I think it's quite important to anticipate, in a certain sense I'm a bit like Cassandra. I'm telling you the worst that's likely to happen, and then hopefully I'll look like a fool in 5 years' time, because none of it did, but hopefully that's because certain of the political things...
hasn't worked with you from 5 years ago.
No, it hasn't.
On the money.
But the sites of intervention then are very difficult. I mean, I'd say, in particular at Goldsmiths, you've got a very particular set of issues, given the subject mix and given the small size of the institution. I mean, Goldsmiths is a very small university. It only has a turnover about 85 million a year, 90 million. Whereas Oxford and Cambridge, their turnover is 1 billion. It's like huge difference in scale. And because the government is very keen to put more research money into the sciences, that's going to take other sources of income away from an institution like Goldsmiths. So, as a site of social intervention, it's very clear that a particular institution is going to be under particular pressures. It's going to be very seductive to play along, particularly if you seem to have some subjects that will fit. But you have to bear in mind that universities can be the villains in this piece. There is a point at which universities stop being a social good and in fact are reinforcing inequality and playing their part in stratification. And you've got to be really brutal with universities under that condition and think seriously about how you intervene in locality. And to be honest, I think student rents, if you're not organising around it, you should be. And somewhere like Goldsmiths is about to have a whole load of big developments. There's a real issue about what pricing is going to be on those student accommodations and how these things are financed. And then, of course, there's the obvious question, which is, you've got to know when to fold them, know when to hold them, know when to walk away, know when to run, as Kenny Rogers once said. And then the question is, how do you, is the alternative spaces really that's where you have to go, because you have to give up on universities because they've become far too compromised. I mean, I think how you have relationships outside the institution, with the locale, with civic, with your graduates after they leave the university and are no longer paying you fees, all these things are fundamental questions, I think, about the place of an institution in the broader politics. Because the real problem is we don't really have sites of intervention. We're not lions roused from slumber. We've kind of infantilized. We've become these children who've lost our political capacity, and somehow those sites of intervention have to be nurtured and rebuilt. And I think that's a really important project. But it may not be that they will be able to intervene to stop something like this, but it may be that they create the exodus conditions for things like this.
Yeah, no, one of the things I wanted to do with the series is to kind of bring the forms of power, which are very intermediated, very analytical, very data-driven, to the attention of people who are kind of impacted by them, which I think has happened really well in this talk.
Yeah, so that's the big thing, is that loans are really about information. The reason the government is so keen on loans is that they generate a new kind of data.
You can account for education in a
and
way.
We switch from having to rely on academics to tell us what's going on in the classroom to coming up with a set of outcomes which, we don't have any direct input into, and often can do not that much about if we want to continue what we went into education for.
But it's also kind of content free, right? So it's not about what the university delivers. It's not about academic freedoms. It's simply about the kind of performance indicators a few years after people have finished. So in a way, the government doesn't have to do traditional, old school, 20th century scary things like change the syllabus of the curriculum and so on.
Yep.
That can just be whatever you want.
Exactly, and this is, in the UK, we've developed this idea of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, which is freedom from direct political imposition.
That's not the issue.
It's not the issue.
Yeah.
It's because it's finances driving things, and the power is being exercised indirectly.
Yeah.
I was going to follow a point there, but I can't remember it.
Wasn't that to do with Kenny Rogers, was it?
No, it might not have been to do with Kenny Rogers. It was. No, I can't remember.
Okay, all right. I just need to put the last thing in to get away from Kenny Rogers. I didn't really want to end. But let's thank Andrew for very good.